In the early months of 1942, after the smoke of Pearl Harbor had barely settled and Japan's empire seemed to be expanding in every direction across the Pacific, a belief took hold inside Tokyo's military high command. The United States was too slow, too divided, and too industrially unprepared to fight a long war. Japanese leaders convinced themselves that American society was soft, politically fractured, and incapable of absorbing losses. They imagined a nation of factories too peaceful to switch into wartime production, a navy too damaged to recover, and a population unwilling to accept the hardships that total war demanded. This belief, however, was only an illusion that would shatter within months when Japan faced a force it had never truly understood: the overwhelming, unstoppable industrial power of the United States. The day Japan realized this truth was the day they understood victory was impossible, even if that realization came far too late. At the heart of Japan's miscalculation was a profound misunderstanding of American industry. Japanese officers saw America through the lens of the 1920s and early 1930s, years of economic depression, labor unrest, and political uncertainty. They assumed American factories were disorganized and inefficient. They believed U.S. industry lacked discipline and central direction. What they didn't understand was that beneath the surface, a giant was sleeping. A giant made of steel mills in Pittsburgh, assembly lines in Detroit, shipyards in California, oil refineries in Texas, and aviation plants stretching across the Midwest. These were not fragile institutions. They were vast, modern, and capable of mobilizing on a scale unmatched by any empire in history. And once awakened, this industrial giant would produce weapons, vehicles, ships, and aircraft so rapidly that Japan could not possibly keep up. Japan's confidence peaked in the first half of 1942. Their navy swept across the Pacific with veteran pilots, elite aircraft like the Mitsubishi Zero, and a sense of invincibility forged by years of battlefield success. But what Japan's strategists didn't see was the transformation happening thousands of miles away inside the United States. Entire cities were being turned into weapons factories. Car companies stopped building cars. Refrigerator plants stopped building appliances. Every piece of machinery, every trained hand, and every yard of steel was redirected into the war effort. America was not preparing for a limited conflict. America was preparing for a war of total, relentless production. The first sign of what was coming appeared in aircraft manufacturing. Before the war, the U.S. aviation industry produced only a few thousand military planes a year. But in 1942 and 1943, this number exploded. Factories like Willow Run in Michigan, designed by Henry Ford's engineers, built B-24 Liberators on a moving assembly line, a concept Japan had never envisioned for heavy bombers. Planes rolled out so rapidly that visiting pilots joked they could watch their aircraft being built faster than they could fill out the paperwork to fly them. At Willow Run's peak, a finished bomber emerged every 55 minutes. No country in the world, let alone Japan, had anything comparable. Japan built aircraft in small workshops, often by hand, with limited mechanization and far fewer skilled workers. While American pilots received brand new fighters every month, Japanese pilots often flew outdated aircraft with no replacements available. The imbalance grew larger with every passing week. Shipbuilding revealed an even greater divide. The United States launched more ships in a single year than Japan launched during the entire war. Liberty ships, simple, rugged cargo vessels essential for transporting supplies, were built at such incredible speeds that one shipyard famously constructed a ship in just 4 days. Japanese commanders hearing these reports refused to believe them. The idea that anyone could build a seaworthy vessel in less than a week sounded like fantasy, and yet it was true. Assembly line shipbuilding, a concept Japan had never developed, allowed the U.S. to replace losses instantly. Every time Japan sank an American vessel, 2 more seemed to appear the following month. By contrast, Japanese shipyards were slow, heavily dependent on manual labor, and often starved of materials like steel, copper, and oil. Even when Japan desperately needed new carriers after losing 4 at Midway, they simply could not build them fast enough. The U.S. launched 17 Essex-class carriers between 1943 and 1945, each one a floating airfield capable of unleashing a storm of aircraft. Japan launched a handful, too few, too late, and without enough pilots to fly from them. But perhaps the most devastating difference of all was something few military strategists talk about: logistics. American soldiers ate better, slept better, and traveled faster than any soldiers in the Pacific. A single U.S. division possessed thousands of vehicles: trucks, jeeps, tractors, bulldozers, fuel carriers, and amphibious transports. Japan had almost none. Japanese soldiers marched on foot across jungles and mountains, often carrying supplies on their backs because there were no trucks available. They starved frequently, went days without fresh water, and suffered from disease partly because their supply lines couldn't deliver medicine. American divisions, by contrast, brought mobile hospitals, refrigeration units, communications gear, and endless ammunition. When U.S. Marines captured Japanese positions, they were shocked at the lack of supplies. When Japanese soldiers captured American positions, they were stunned at the abundance. One Japanese officer wrote in his diary, "We fight men who eat more in one day than we eat in 3." He added, "Their supplies are endless. Their machines do the work of entire regiments." That difference, more than aircraft or ships, decided countless battles. The deeper truth was that American production wasn't just large, it was accelerating. Every month the numbers climbed higher: more tanks, more aircraft, more submarines, more carriers, more ammunition, more everything. Japan had no way to match this. Oil shortages crippled their ability to train pilots. Factory bombings slowed production. Skilled workers were drafted into the army. And worst of all, Japanese leadership refused to modernize their industrial system. They continued building weapons the old way, believing craftsmanship mattered more than speed. Meanwhile, the United States embraced standardization, mass production, interchangeable parts, and streamlined design. A broken American aircraft engine could be replaced in hours. A broken Japanese engine sometimes required a craftsman to rebuild it by hand. By late 1943, the Japanese High Command finally saw what was happening. Intelligence reports delivered production numbers so large that many officers assumed they were mistakes. They could not believe a single American factory produced more aircraft engines per month than Japan produced aircraft. They could not believe U.S. shipyards built more tonnage in 1 year than the entire Japanese empire. They could not believe American manufacturers produced more trucks, radios, ammunition, boots, uniforms, and food than Japan could ever hope to field. But the numbers were real. And when Admiral Yamamoto, who had studied in the United States decades earlier, learned the truth, he was not surprised. He had warned his government before the war. If Japan fought the United States in a long conflict, it would be ruined. His warning had gone unheeded. From 1944 onward, the industrial gap became overwhelming. U.S. submarines built in huge numbers hunted Japanese shipping until the empire was strangled. Without oil, Japan's planes couldn't fly. Without replacement ships, Japan's navy couldn't fight. Without trucks, soldiers couldn't move. Without food, armies starved. It was not a single battle that decided Japan's fate. It was not Midway, or Guadalcanal, or the Marianas. It was the simple, brutal reality that the United States could build more of everything, faster, cheaper, and in quantities that defied imagination. Japan entered the war with courage, discipline, and incredible fighting spirit. But courage cannot forge steel. Discipline cannot create fuel. Spirit cannot build factories. In the end, the war was decided not by heroism, but by industry. And so came the day Japan realized victory was impossible. It wasn't marked by a single event, but by a growing recognition that the machine they had awakened in America was bigger, stronger, and more relentless than anything they had prepared for. When Japanese officers visited American factories after the war, they walked into buildings that seemed to stretch forever. They saw assembly lines that built engines faster than Japan had built propellers. They saw entire workforces larger than Japanese divisions. They saw the industrial power that had crushed their empire. And they understood the truth, at last. They had never truly been fighting the United States military. They had been fighting the United States industrial system, a force that could not be defeated.
Japan's realization grew heavier as the war dragged into its final stages, when even their most dedicated commanders could no longer ignore the evidence piling up around them. Reports from the front described battles where American forces fought with a level of firepower that seemed endless. Japanese soldiers spoke of facing artillery barrages that shook entire islands for hours, followed by waves of tanks, trucks, and amphibious vehicles that appeared to have no limit. They witnessed skies filled with American aircraft, not a handful, but hundreds at a time, replacing each other in a rotation so constant that the sun seemed to shine through the wings of an unbroken stream of bombers and fighters. This was not the type of war Japan had prepared to fight. Their entire military doctrine had been built around the idea of striking fast, winning early, and forcing negotiations before the industrial might of their enemies could fully mobilize. But the United States did not negotiate. The United States mobilized. And once it did, the weight of its production became a tide that no amount of bravery or tactical skill could halt. Inside Japan, factories struggled to keep up even the pretense of wartime production. Shortages of metal forced manufacturers to melt down household goods. Copper wiring became scarce. Shipyards repurposed steel that had been intended for buildings. Workers toiled long hours with aging machines, often by candlelight during air raids, while American factories operated with modern equipment and abundant electricity. Japanese planes rolled off the assembly line with inferior armor, weaker engines, and limited weaponry because Japan simply lacked the resources to produce anything better. Meanwhile, the United States continuously upgraded its designs, refining the P-51 Mustang, the B-29 Superfortress, the Hellcat, and countless other aircraft that would dominate the skies. Every month brought a new model, faster, stronger, and more reliable than the last. Japanese pilots who once enjoyed superiority early in the war soon found themselves flying outdated Zero fighters against American planes that could outclimb, outturn, outshoot, and outrun them in nearly every category. Japan's situation on the sea was even worse. American shipyards launched warships in numbers so staggering that Japanese admirals privately admitted the war was unwinnable. The few carriers Japan managed to complete late in the war sailed with skeleton air groups, barely trained pilots, and limited fuel. American carriers, however, traveled in massive task forces, each protected by layers of destroyers, cruisers, and battleships, all guided by advanced radar systems. When American fleets appeared off a Japanese-held island, they brought with them entire floating cities of steel, fuel, medical ships, repair vessels, and supply transports. Japan had no equivalent. Their navy, once feared across the Pacific, slowly became a ghost of its former self, unable to replace losses and forced to conserve every drop of fuel. Sometimes Japanese destroyers remained docked for weeks because they lacked the oil to conduct even basic training. As American submarines tightened their grip around Japan's sea routes, the empire began to starve, not metaphorically, but literally. Tankers carrying oil from the Dutch East Indies were sunk one after another. Merchant ships carrying food, raw materials, and military supplies never reached their destinations. Factories that relied on imported metal found themselves idle. Soldiers stationed on distant islands ran out of ammunition. Civilians in Japan rationed every grain of rice. And while Japan struggled to survive, American factories continued producing more than they could even ship into combat. American supply depots overflowed with crates of rations, fuel barrels, spare parts, ammunition, uniforms, and medical kits. The contrast was devastating, one side drowning in abundance, the other choking on scarcity. By 1945, the difference in production wasn't merely a strategic advantage, it was a complete domination of the war's outcome. American B-29 bombers flew over Japan in waves that darkened the sky, dropping more explosive power in a single night than Japan had produced in months. Japanese cities burned under the weight of firebombing raids that sprang from a manufacturing system capable of building fleets of long-range bombers faster than Japan could shoot them down. Some Japanese officers argued that victory might still be possible through one final decisive battle, a clash that would inflict such heavy casualties on the United States that it would reconsider its demands. But even this hope was a fantasy. American production had reached a point where losses no longer mattered. For every plane shot down, America had dozens more waiting. For every ship lost, a new one was already sailing across the Pacific. For every casualty, thousands of new soldiers were trained, equipped, and transported with efficiency that Japan could not even comprehend. The culmination of Japan's realization came when they studied American soldiers taken prisoner. Many Japanese officers were astonished, not by the prisoners' morale, but by their equipment. They found soldiers carrying radios with superior range, rifles with higher manufacturing consistency, boots that lasted longer, and medical kits far more advanced than anything Japan could produce. Some carried chocolate rations that provided more calories than an entire Japanese meal. Others carried water purification tablets, insect repellent, and emergency supplies Japan had never issued to even its elite units. These details may have seemed small individually, but collectively they reflected an industrial system capable of producing not just weapons, but comfort, safety, and sustainability for every single soldier in the field. The final shock came when Japan surrendered, when its officers toured American factories and shipyards as part of post-war inspections. What they saw left them speechless. Warehouses filled with engines ready for installation, assembly lines stretching farther than the eye could see, and factories employing tens of thousands of workers per shift. Machines stamped out identical parts in a fraction of the time it took Japanese craftsmen to build components by hand. Raw materials flowed into these factories on rail lines that never stopped moving. Entire ships were built indoors, protected from weather, allowing uninterrupted production year-round. In one aircraft plant, a Japanese engineer stood stunned as he watched a conveyor system deliver parts to workers with perfect timing, eliminating wasted motion. Another Japanese officer reportedly said, "If we had known this, we would never have gone to war." It was not an exaggeration. The scale of American production was so overwhelming that it redefined their understanding of industrial warfare. Japan finally understood that it had not lost because its soldiers lacked bravery or its strategy lacked intelligence. It lost because it had entered a contest of manufacturing against the most industrially powerful nation in human history.